Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Red Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Coltin Schachtner-Kramer. Red Effect Podcast is brought to you by REDSTAR. REDSTAR, where our red makes you green. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Red Effect Podcast. I'm your host, Coltin Schachtner. Today, we have a familiar face again, Tom Stanton. He's getting pretty close to his 5-episode prize. We got to figure out what we're doing for that. And today we got a new face. So, John, if you would just introduce yourself and give a little background, that'd be great.
Well, my name is John Person. I've been with REDSTAR for a few years now. I work in their agronomy part. I've been in the agronomy or in the fertilizer business since '79, was I walked my first cornfields.
Yeah, it's a while before I was born. So
I was walking cornfields in '79.
Yeah, just with your dad.
Holding my dad's hand.
So everybody, today the topic we want to touch on, I believe, is a pretty important one, and that is fall fertilizer. So we'll hear a lot of different ways to go about fall fertilizer. So I got two guys who have obviously been in this industry a long time, and they're pretty good at it. So I just want to dive into it. So what's the first thing that we need to do when we're looking at fall fertilizer? And specifically, when I'm looking at this, I think let's soil test. So what does REDSTAR offer in terms of soil testing to help our growers understand what they need to do for fall fertilizer?
Yeah, I'll hit on that part of it first before we get in and talk about what 24 looked like and what the crop looks like and how that's going to affect the fertility we've got. Colton, one of the things that we're doing now at REDSTAR is something called REDSTAR 360 or RX 360. And what we're doing, it's a brand new concept on taking soil tests. And I've always been big on, DNA analysis. I've done some of that on my own farms. And now with what we're doing with RX 360, we're going to go out, take your traditional soil test. And I think you'll talk about, we're also going to take a Haney test along with that. But we're also now going to be doing a DNA analysis of your soil. And what really got me about this program is all the way down to 0.8 of an acre. We've got people that talk about 2.5 and 4.5 acre grids. We're going to actually test this down to 0.8 of an acre. And so we're going to get a really good view from a traditional soil test standpoint, but also on the DNA side. We're going to be able to start actually being able to make recommendations for a farm and not guessing. Like, where's the rootworm pressure? Do I have it? Do I don't have it? This DNA analysis is going to tell us where the rootworm pressure's at. White mold. 23, John, was a really bad year for us with white mold and soybeans. Now with this RX 360, we can actually find out how much white mold is in our soil and maybe where those hot spots are going to be and, then how we can treat those hot spots. But from that standpoint, I'm really excited about that because we're going to get more information than ever before about our customers' fields and be able to do a better job of not only recommending fertilizer, but other things like insecticides and possibly even fungicides to help with some of these issues that we're seeing.
Yeah, you hit on something really I think is very important, is taking the guesswork out of it. Agronomy really is half science and half art. Well, if we can help with improve the science we have to take that guesswork out of it, we're going to really be able to not only help our customers, but help us to understand, we need to maybe put this hybrid out there because of what's out there, or this fungicide might work here, but we need to switch it up because that doesn't cover the diseases that are present there.
Yeah, exactly. Like I had the opportunity this spring to actually do this RX 360 on one of my farms, and I was shocked how much fusarium and phytophthora came back. Those levels were all the way to the red, and I'm like, I really didn't know that was a problem, but I'm glad it's soybeans this year. I'm like, and I'm really glad that I had a really good soybean seed treatment on my soybeans, otherwise that could have potentially been a problem.
And John, with like fusarium, you cannot treat that with a foliar application of fungicide, right?
That is correct. In this process, me being of the old school, I had a lot of skepticism at first. We did our test plot the other day. We kind of opened a bunch of stocks, different treatments. And some of the stocks towards one side of the test plot had gibberella in them. So Colton looked on the report back on that farm, and lo and behold, that part of the farm had higher potential to grow. So it is a real valid process.
Yeah, I just think it's going to take the guesswork out. It's actually going to make me feel like I know something, so I can make the right recommendation for a farm. But as we've talked before, technology continues to change, and this is just another example of how I believe it's true what I hear, that technology is going to change agriculture more in the next 10 years than it has the last 40. And with programs like RX360, I firmly believe it.
And one thing I want to add too is with this RX program, you can upgrade packages to go beyond just your DNA test and your soil sampling. We are also offering it's a late LiDAR machine that goes across the field. So we can get down to 10 by 10 meter zones, and that is 100 times more precise than a 2.5 acre grid. And we can measure compaction in that field. So if it's AccuSet by John Deere or Soil Command, we could actually make VRT Rex for that machine to go through that field and manage that compaction.
Yeah, and I'm going to guess that compaction is going to be a little bit of an issue for us this fall and into next year with all the rain we had. I mean, an acre inch of water is 27,200 gallons, and at 8.34 pounds per gallon, that's a lot of weight. And then if you got 33, 4, 5 inches like we had this year in places, I think the compaction is going to be an issue for us.
The splash of a raindrop is the number one cause of surface compaction that we deal with.
There's a fun fact I didn't know.
Hits every time.
It hits every time. That's why it hurts my head when it lands on it.
So when we're looking, like you said, we're going to talk about last year. So looking forward to 25 with this DNA test, what are some things that we think that we might see? So let's take white mold for an example. Crops in 23 had white mold going into 25. Well, one, we're going to be able to understand whether we have it or not. But what can we do to control it if we do have white mold out in those fields?
Yeah, I would really encourage, because it was really bad in 23, and it cost us significant yield. And so I'm hoping that we can go into some of those farms that were in 2023 were soybeans, that now this year are corn. I hope we can go in and sample some of those farms so we can really get a good understanding of really where the white mold's at. But in general, a lot of people are like, hey, what fungicide can I put on white mold to control it? And I'm like, well, white mold's not a foliar-borne disease. It's in the soil. And that sclerotia that is in our soil, it overwinters in our soil. It can stay there for up to 10 years. As that sclerotia starts to grow and feed, that's where it's going to grow. And then all of a sudden, when it gets to its maturity, it's going to puff out all these spores. And that's what's affecting our beans. And there's a product called Contans. It's been around for a long time. It's really a biological fungicide. And what we do is we go out and we put that on either in the fall, so we can go out and spray it on the corn stalks this fall, where we're going to plant beans next year, or we can come in next spring and we can plant it or apply it before planting or right after planting. And let's get that bacteria in that soil so it's going to eat those sclerotia, so we can help minimize it. And that's just the first step. It's a really good step. But then also, let's look at some other options as we get into that late June, as we get from vegetative to R1 on soybeans, making sure that we get in there with, like a generic fungicide would work, just to help protect those early blooms at R1.
The best time to treat any of these issues, whether white mold or diseases for corn, is early. If you can slow them down early, stop them early, you lengthen the health of the plant immensely.
Yeah.
An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure.
Yeah, it is. And Colton, just if I can, one more thing on it. Even this year, I've heard there's some white mold scatterings here and there. And I just continue to hear about growers talking about, hey, what can I put on for a fungicide? And again, understanding that white mold is a soil-borne disease, and we really can't take care of a soil-borne disease with fungicides that are designed for foliar application.
Definitely. So moving on from that, obviously 25 is going to be a tight year. And a lot of guys might think the best way to reduce input costs is to cut fall fertilizer, specifically phosphorus or potassium. So, John, what would be your advice to somebody who says, I'm going to cut out all my phosphorus and just save that money in order to help my bottom line?
Well, I think the number one thing you need to look at is what we're going to produce this year, what you want to produce next year. If you plan to failure, you will fail. Just because prices are cheap doesn't mean the corn plant is going to understand that you're going to cut fertilizer.
Yeah.
That's just not how it's going to work. One of the things to look at also is with all the rains we've had, and you know it, if you were in the fields, say 3-4 weeks ago, you saw a fairly high rate of nitrogen, sulfur, and potassium deficiency. We saw the corn plants yellowing almost up to the ear leaf. Well, that's our carryover for next year, and we plan on that. So not only are we going to be short carryover, if you don't apply something to replace that carryover, you have a double whammy. You're going to be short in 2 different ways.
Yeah, I mean, we've got a pretty good crop out here in the field, and just the amount of removal that's going to take place with P and K is going to be really high. And also on that fact, we're going to have, a lot of nutrients left in that stover as well. But I wrote down just before we started, 250 bushel corn, it takes 128 pounds of phosphorus, and it takes 338 pounds of potassium just to grow 250 bushel corn. Now you start talking about cutting or not putting back on removal rates, and I get gray hair from that.
So with that, Tom, and I know we've talked about breakdown before, but when we look at the soil in the top 6 inches, we can have 50 to 60,000 pounds of potassium out there. Do you think that by adding breakdown, we could not eliminate, but reduce the amount of fertilizer we have to apply just because we're going to cycle those nutrients from the stover and release some from the soil?
Yeah, again, every field is different. Every farmer's unique. That's kind of, we talk about that at REDSTAR all the time. And so I think we can't take a cookie cutter approach. I think we have to know our soil test.
Yep.
Need to know what's in that soil test. I need to know the crop that I've pulled off this year before I can go in and say, if I've traditionally been putting on, for example, 80 pounds of phosphorus and 80 pounds of potassium, I'm going to want to know all that information before I make a decision. Now, specific to breakdown, again, we did a lot of work with it this year, and we showed, through Regen Labs out in Pleasanton, Nebraska, that we freed up $163 an acre worth of total fertilizer. Okay. That's NPK, micros, calcium, magnesium, everything. So we do know we can be more efficient on that piece of ground to help mine or pull that fertilizer back out of that stover and put it into a carbon base to where it's going to be available to that plant next year. So I think it's a great start to be able to do that. In terms of cutting back on P and K this fall, not really a fan of it, simply because, it takes a tremendous amount of phosphorus and potassium just to grow that plant in order to give us a good yield that's going to make us some money.
I would agree totally. One good thing about the breakdown, as we look at the crop this year, we also have, in what we have to break down, it's going to be a little bit lower because of the nutrient deficiency we have in the crop. So the dry fertilizer, or replacing what we put out there, is extremely important. But on the other hand, if we break down naturally what we have out there, we also put it into a form that's available next year, as opposed to maybe 2 years from now. One of those nutrients was magnesium that was more available. Most of our plants show a magnesium deficiency in Nebraska. And the magnesium that it breaks down is going to be more readily available than any magnesium you could put out there. So the best of both worlds would be to do both. And I think there's a happy medium in there.
Yeah, and any time that we can get a nutrient that's been cycled by the soil microbiome, bacteria and fungi in the soil, it's attached to carbon, and that plant wants to pull that up. Absolutely. I mean, the plant would prefer actually to have that type of nutrient, and so I think that's critical. One of the things, John, that you just mentioned a little bit ago, nitrogen. I think we're extremely low in nitrogen in our top 2 to 3 feet. Seeing all kinds of deficiencies, at least in the corn crop. What kind of an impact is that going to have on us as we head into 25?
I feel it's going to be very large. It's going to do several things. The shortage of nitrogen, and it's just not nitrogen, it's sulfur and potassium, those 3 main ones. As they are short in the stover that we are currently harvesting, its release rate is going to be less for next year also. So not only are we putting less out there, we've already used up anything that we would have carried for last year. So it's, like I said, it's kind of a double whammy. Part of that also comes from the last 3 years of drought. As the drought affects our soil, the organic matter will fall, the biologicals will fall, and then the release rate is slower. So this is actually probably a very critical year not to skimp on fertilizer.
And you brought up a good point there, John, about low in potassium in those top 3 feet. And a lot of people at home might be thinking, well, potassium's positively charged, so we shouldn't leach it. Well, in fact, if we don't have a spot in the soil for that potassium to hold on to, we are going to start to move it down through the profile. It's much slower than nitrate or a sulfur would be, but we're still going to move it down until it can find a home. So that's something that a lot of people don't think about, is we can lose some potassium.
And a lot of times, potassium deficiency is mistaken for nitrogen deficiency. Mm-hmm. And I saw potassium deficiencies a lot earlier and a lot more often this year than normal.
And the N-to-K ratio is 1-to-1. So if you've got a unit of potassium and you don't have a unit of nitrogen, that plant's not going to pull either one. It's got to be there in a 1-to-1 ratio.
And Tom, that brings us to another great point, is sometimes I feel as if, as both retailers and growers, we like to get wrapped up in P and K. But from what we're seeing from our test plots, our micronutrients are just as, if not more, important to our crop success than our 3 macronutrients. So can you two touch on some of the key ratios we need to be looking at in some of the fertilizers that we might want to spend a little bit more money on that we traditionally haven't?
Yeah, great question. And let's look at phosphorus, since we've talked quite a bit about that here today. So the P phosphorus to ZN zinc ratio is 10-to-1. So for every 10 parts of phosphorus I have, I need 1 part zinc.
And very rarely is that achieved, especially where we're from with lots of hog manure. We just very rarely get that good ratio.
We look at a lot of soil tests, us 3 do. Rarely do I see a sample where it's got zinc or manganese or even boron to where I go, wow, I'm happy with that sample. It's usually the other way around. We've tended to focus more on P and K and nitrogen applications over the years. There hasn't been enough discussion, in my opinion, regarding the micronutrients. So in regards to that 10P, 1Z, you can have a lot of phosphorus out there, but if you don't have the zinc, guess what? The plant can't pull the phosphorus or the zinc. So that phosphorus just stays in your soil. And so I think balance is probably a really good word here. Let's take a look at that soil test. Let's make sure and look at that ratio, because you know what? We might be better served this year. We might have enough phosphorus in our soil. I might be better off going out there with 25 to 35 pounds of zinc sulfate this fall with a spread and actually make my phosphorus more available.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And John, you talked about sulfur deficiency, and that is something that I've only been in one grower's field where he doesn't have sulfur deficiency, and he puts a ton of gypsum on every other year. So he's getting enough sulfur. But other than that, it's very deficient. So what do you think would be the best form of sulfur? Because I don't believe elemental, unless you own the field, elemental will eventually pay you or your grandkids. But what can we do this fall to set us up to start seeing less sulfur deficiencies?
Well, sulfur deficiencies can come from numerous things. Sulfur not only feeds the plant, but it also feeds the soil. So the timing of when you apply the sulfur, whether it's an elemental or a sulfate, is important. If you have a tremendous amount of organic matter or stover, you apply it in the fall, a larger percent of that is going to go to feed the soil or the stover. So the answer is not black and white. We need about 80 pounds of sulfur to raise a good crop of beans, corn. None of us are putting that on. We've lost our sulfur out of our diesel fuel. But I think we need to look at those, as Tom said, on an individual field by field basis. I agree with you. Elemental is for the people to come, but yet in the same token, we can't just throw sulfate out there in the fall and expect it to be there in June when the corn needs it. It needs to be on a base by base, field by field basis.
Yeah, I'd agree. And sulfur is one of those nutrients that I think that we're not using near enough. And most of the time when folks are using it, they're getting sold a form, as you mentioned earlier with elemental, that, it takes a long time for elemental sulfur to oxidize, to become sulfate, to be available. I mean, in our part of the world, it can take, John, 15, 18 months for it just to happen. So I think the right form at the right time, one part of the 4 R's, I think is critical when you start talking something like sulfur.
We have so many options with sulfur, polysulfate, for an example. We have ammonium sulfate, we have elemental sulfur, we have potassium sulfate. I mean, there's just a variety of ways to go about it, and there's a right way for your field. There's not a right way for everybody's field.
Yeah. You mentioned, John, polysulfate, and that's something new that we are working with at REDSTAR this year. Can you tell me a little bit about polysulfate, what it is and what you like about it?
Polysulfate is mined from underneath the Dead Sea. It's about, I think, 4,000 feet down. It's a granular, it's dry. What I like about it is it's well balanced. It's got some magnesium, sulfur, potassium, and calcium. And those are all products that the plant needs every year, but we seem to have them in the right form with polysulfate. And it should be a very good fit. If you put a little phosphorus and a little zinc with that, you can build a real balanced program with that product.
Definitely. And having that product have calcium in it, I think that's a very important thing, because even though we look at our soil tests and we have 4,000 to 5,000 part per million calcium, we should be fine. Well, actually, we have very little plant available calcium, and calcium is one of the building blocks of life. It's the transporter of over 7 different nutrients of the plant. So to me, it is key to make sure we have sufficient levels of calcium in order for everything else to work.
Of free calcium,
yes.
Yeah. One of the things that I like about polysulfate, and this kind of goes back a couple of years ago to some research work that John did, and he was working with potassium sulfate, sulfate of potash to some out there. And the fact that sulfate of potash, again, sulfur's kind of the key to everything, but that sulfate of potash has got a lot of things going for it. One, it's got a much, much lower level of salt or chloride, if any. And two, it's got that sulfur attached to it. So when that gets into the soil and breaks down, that plant just has an affinity for it, kind of like me and Snicker bars. I mean, whenever there's a Snicker bar around, I'm going to have it. And potassium sulfate of potash is sort of that way. And that's one of the things that drew me to this product, was just the work that John did, and the fact that it's balanced. It's calcium sulfate, it's magnesium sulfate, it's the sulfate forms of nutrients that are in it, which to me, I can use less of it, but get more.
So when we're talking about fertilizer, there's a lot of debate on the placement of the fertilizer. And I think the placement is one of the most important things. To me, I would prefer strict till over broadcast. Now, that's not applicable for everybody, but what's your guys' opinions on strip till versus broadcast if it is available to a grower?
It all depends on where you're at. Do you have irrigation? Are you in an arid part of the state or the Midwest? If you have horizontal roots, if you have vertical roots, there is so much. So there's more to it than just whether it's broadcast or not. If you're going to keep the top 6 inches of your soil wet all year, broadcast is great, and then you can capitalize on that nutrients throughout the soil profile. If you are dry land and you need the moisture to come from the roots, then deep placement is the best place for those nutrients, so you have moisture to bring them up. So is there a right answer? Yeah, they're all right in the right situation.
Just whatever the best bad idea you got that day.
Right. Again, I'm going to come back to the soil test. I think it really depends on your soil test, and I'm going to switch gears here a little bit. If I've got a 5 CEC or a 25 CEC, that's probably going to affect a little bit about what I'm doing there, if I'm going to broadcast or if I'm going to strip till. The other thing I'm going to take a really big look at is I'm going to look at my calcium and magnesium base saturations. What are those levels? I've got one of my farms in Iowa, in southeast Iowa. If I go out there and put potash on it this fall, I'll just blow that potash right through the soil, because most of the soil colloid, or the CEC, is taken up by calcium and magnesium. There's no place for me to hold that. And so places like that, strip till works really good. Now, I'm a little bit biased, and I'll admit it. I like strip till. I do a fair amount of strip till on my ground. However, this year I'm probably not, simply because I've got my levels of phosphorus, my levels of potassium in a pretty good place. And so I am probably not going to strip till it this fall, and I'm probably going to go back next spring and, probably go in real early with my PMK application with ammonium sulfate when that corn's V2, V3. So again, I think you got to look at your soil, look at the soil test, and I got to think you got to basically plan and make a plan for each field on your farm to where it makes sense.
Definitely. Strip till and anhydrous kind of go hand in hand. Now, Tom, you and I are fans of anhydrous. We like what it does for the nutrient availability. It also breaks up some calcium and helps our plant out. And it's oftentimes the most economical form of nitrogen. Obviously, when we're looking at anhydrous, we got to look at our CEC.
Yes.
Because one CEC can hold 10 pounds of nitrogen, and that ammoniacal form won't move in the soil, but there is a risk it can convert. So, John, being the guy from Nebraska, what's your opinion on anhydrous for these Nebraska fields, and would you put a stabilizer with it 100% of the time?
Anhydrous is ammonia. The plant needs a fair amount of ammonia. If you have no ammonia, the plant has to make it. It takes energy and it takes water to make that. So whether you put on any anhydrous or not, your plant is using some ammonia. So I have not a problem with ammonia at all. Fall ammonia in the Platte Valley, is where I'm from, is a no-no. That's the NRD will not allow that. So, but in the clay, yeah, I'm okay with ammonia. I prefer spring ammonia.
I'd agree.
But ultimately, sidedress ammonia is amazing. If we could just get people to do that, therefore, that kind of leads into liquid urea, which is ammonium or ammonia.
Mm-hmm.
It's the ammoniacal form of nitrogen because that when the plant starts to reproduce, it switches from nitrate to ammonium needs. The problem we have with putting on ammonia or liquid at any point in time is the conversion factor.
Right.
So if we can back to the right place at the right product at the right time is where, yes, ammonia has a very strong place in our agricultural.
And Colton, where you and I are from, anhydrous is really big. And a lot of it has to do with our soil type. It's so heavy.
It is.
Right? And CECs of 25 to 35. And, it does actually break that calcium free. We actually get better calcium uptake when we do anhydrous with it. But one of the biggest things that I saw this past year with anhydrous, whether it was fall applied or spring applied, is with all the water and stuff we had, if we didn't have a plan to come back in crop with some additional nitrogen, there's a lot of those fields that got hurt pretty bad in 2024. And so again, I think, fall fertilizer plan, I think have a plan, not just for this fall, but also start looking at next spring. Yep, this is what I'm doing this fall, but man, let's have that plan next spring from planting, all the way through either a Y drop or pivot applications of nitrogen, once we get to tassel and R1, R2 gray fill.
Definitely. And one interesting thing, even though we got a lot of moisture this spring, you could still pick out those anhydrous lines because it was so dry in the fall.
Yes.
So I like that, Tom. Always be ready to call the audible and do what's best for your crop.
Grandma always said that too much of anything is bad for you. And that's with your strip till question. Is it the right thing to strip till every year? Well, maybe, and maybe not. Is it the right thing to no till every year? Maybe not. Is it the right thing to till every year? Probably not. But again, I think we have to become quick change artists, and we have to be able to make decisions on the fly. And the only way we can do that is we've got to have the information, and that all starts in the fall with that soil test information.
If you have the soil test, which is the best place to start, and then you're in your fields, look at your fields, take some tissue samples. Are we becoming short of something? Watch the rainfalls. You can also take some samples, deep samples. We took a fair amount of 6-inch increment soil samples this spring after the rains, and we found that the nitrogen had moved on some fields more than others. Just be ready to react to the situation. And there's things that we can do as agronomy people, fertilizer people, to help you through that, to know when you need to change, when you don't.
Yeah, definitely. And change for a lot of guys it's hard, but it's something we need to do every year. And just because at the beginning of the year you think you built this bulletproof plan, well, Mother Nature gets the final say at everything. That plan is only as good as the first contact.
And you got to be willing to make a change.
Absolutely.
Too, right? And I think that's as we look at this year, and John can attest because John walks a lot of fields. Spring, summer, and fall, all you got to do is call, right, John?
That's correct.
But, a lot of things that we learned this year is that, the plan that we had to go back in and do that audible or, bring in that picture, that other pitcher in the 7th inning. And I guess as we look at this fall, it's super dry right now. Mm-hmm. I mean, in a lot of places here in Northeast Nebraska, we haven't had rain since tail end of July?
It's been almost 60 days since we've had measurable rain.
So that we've got to take into account as well with our fertilizer plan for next year.
Yeah, definitely. So we've walked through soil samples, getting our plan together. So in this scenario, we've got our soil samples, we got our plan together, we've talked to our REDSTAR agronomist, and we're ready to go. But we want something to make that fertilizer more available. What can we do for those farmers who are looking to do that?
Yeah, so obviously we've got some options here. We talked about breakdown earlier. That's going to be more of a liquid application that we can put on in the fall. So if you're going to do some fall herbicide type work, you can put the breakdown with that and kind of get two birds with one stone, as they say. On dry, we've got a product called Magna Trio, and Magna Trio is a very broad spectrum biological, bacteria and fungi, and it's also an amino acid polymer. And so it's doing two things. One, we're going to help increase that soil's activity of bacteria and fungi to help break down that phosphorus and that potassium to be able to make that more plant available. And when we do that, we've got an amino acid polymer there that's got a pretty high net negative charge that's actually gonna help that phosphorus tie with carbon and not tie back up with calcium or magnesium in your soil. And so what we have seen, we've seen an average of around 8.7 bushels per acre yield increase where we're putting that on our MAP or DAP in the fall.
And I think that's a huge point, is the tie-up of the phosphorus. And when we look at phosphorus, we think, oh, we just spread it and it's there when we need it. Well, it's not quite that way. Phosphorus likes to tie up with a lot of different things in the soil. So if we can prevent that and just keep it available, that's going to be huge to our crops.
Yeah, it is. And that's one of the reasons why we developed MagnaTrio the way we did, is because we know that biologicals work to break down nutrients. Okay. And sometimes when they get broke down, they get, especially phosphorus, it gets broke down and it's got a highly negative charge. Well, calcium and magnesium are just going to gobble that thing right up. And so by putting that amino acid polymer in there, it's really helped us to be able to keep that phosphorus more plant available for next year's crop.
And with next year's prices, we don't need to spend any money on products that aren't efficient.
Mm-hmm.
It's usually important next year with prices.
Definitely. And especially looking at our DNA tests, with a significant portion of our fields not being able to solubilize phosphorus properly, one, adding something that can help with that in the either breakdown or MagnaTrio, but two, what we do put out there, making sure we don't lose it just to tie up, because we cannot make that available again. That is key for moving.
It is.
All righty, guys. Well, thank you for coming on here. Did we miss anything?
Probably my snack, but other than that,
Should see it when he eats a Snickers. He turns into Arnold Schwarzenegger.
that's right. Yeah, absolutely. Me and Snickers, we got a good relationship.
All righty. Thank you, guys.